Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for coming. I'm really excited to celebrate the release of my first album with all of you tonight. We're going to hear some of the music from the album on tonight's program, but first, I wanted to tell you a bit about the intellectual and creative journey that led to it. And I also want to share with you some treasures from YIVO, which is from YIVO's archives. So I've been working here at YIVO for a bit more than 3 years now. It's the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, which is, I think as you're going to get to know a bit more during this program, an incredible repository of materials that document Jewish life around the world and all of its aspects. And more will come out, but it's an incredible archive of more than 23 million documents and over 400,000 books. So working here has been much more than a job for me. Intellectually, it's been nothing short of inspiring. Every day that I've been working here, I encounter incredible pieces of history and culture. This has been really exciting for my creative work, and I'm going to talk about that. But on a personal level as well, YIVO has been a really special place for me. My coworkers here are like a family, and the creativity, the humanity, the dedication of the many amazing scholars, researchers, and students who I've had the pleasure of meeting here continue to amaze me every day. So I want to say a few words of thanks. I want to thank everyone that is a part of this amazing YIVO community, and I want to thank my family who's been incredibly supportive. I want to thank everyone at Cantaloupe Music who helped make this record a reality, and I want to thank all of the amazing collaborators on the album, and the musicians who you're going to hear, and also everyone who helped us support it. I also want to thank Irina Klepfish, who wrote the liner notes for this disc, and I hope that you'll buy a copy and read the liner notes. They're really so beautiful, and I was really honored that she wrote them. I met Irina when we were working together on a commemorative event marking the 120th anniversary of the founding of the Jewish Labor Bund in October 2017. In her creativity, her kindness, and her social consciousness, she embodies so much of what makes me proud to be a part of this community. She's a really singular presence, and as I said, I'm honored that she wrote the notes on the album and that she's here with us tonight. And finally, I want to thank Michael Gordon and Julia Wolf. My freshman year of college, one of my TAs, a composer named Ted Hearn, gave me a list of recent pieces that I ought to check out. One of the pieces on that list had the irreverent name Yo Shakespeare. I remember the first time I heard it, I found it oddly satisfying and deceptively simple. I told everyone that would listen to me about this piece. That first encounter with Michael Gordon's music and my subsequent interest in Julia Wolf's music and David Lang's music and in the whole world of Bang on a Can really set me on the path that I've been on as a composer. So years later, I had the great pleasure of getting to know Michael and Julie when I studied with them at NYU. And I can't tell you how much of an honor it is for me to be releasing this album on their record label. So thank you to them. Okay, so now YIVO and this whole world. One of the bagel shops that I frequented as a kid was called Essa Bagel. It's still there, actually. Well, it's moved across the street. Though the name was very familiar to me, only many years later, when I was studying Yiddish, did it dawn on me that that name actually means something. It's Yiddish for eat a bagel. My connection to Jewish language was through Hebrew, which I studied a few nights after school each week. But this wasn't the language that my family had spoken in any remotely accessible past. In fact, growing up, when I'd hear my grandfather speak Hebrew on occasion, I thought his Hebrew was even worse than mine, because it had this thick Brooklyn accent. How could I have a connection to this language of my ancient ancestors when it seemed that my not-so-ancient ancestors didn't? I learned later that it wasn't a Brooklyn accent that my grandfather spoke Hebrew with, it was a Yiddish accent. So I grew up amidst the ruins of a once great Yiddish language culture. unaware of what was around me. Even the words that I did understand, the ones that made their way into Jewish American vernacular English, like spiel and schlep, chutzpah, mishigas, oi, I didn't always know originated in Yiddish. I was in for a real awakening when I went to college and encountered non-Jews who weren't from New York and realized that they didn't know some of these words. When I started working at YIVO in February 2016, and I began learning Yiddish and becoming acquainted with the wider world of Jewish studies, all of those abandoned ruins and all of those remnants that I knew, they started to come into focus. It felt like a homecoming. What was so amazing about it is it wasn't a return to the Jewish experiences that I had already had. The bored evenings at Hebrew school, which I dreaded, the occasional time we spent in synagogue, the hundreds of times my sister and I watched Fiddler on the Roof. It was a homecoming to a Jewish world that I never quite knew existed, in which these fragments and these remnants were the stuff of poetry. A world in which a simple plum can be the center of a profound poem about the meaning of art. A world in which the language that I was told my grandparents' parents used to tell their secrets is also a language of erotic poetry. A world in which history, language, culture can unite Jews across time and space, and the religious and the political differences that can otherwise narrow and divide these really meaningful and expansive connections. As a composer, the music in YIVO's vast collection was of particular interest to me. As I started curating concerts at YIVO, reading books about its holdings, and searching through its archives, I discovered so many musical treasures. A popular song about the pleasure of a family visit to Coney Island, a song by a survivor lamenting that the Messiah is already too late, a whole slew of songs recasting the Song of Songs onto melodramatic love stories on 2nd Avenue. One thing in particular that I encountered, which really fascinated me, was a movement in classical music that I'd never learned about in my many years and 2 degrees studying composition. In 1908, a group of composers from the St. Petersburg Conservatory, including students of Rimsky-Korsakov, founded a musical organization dedicated to the pursuit of a particularly Jewish classical music. Just as Bela Bartok worked as both an ethnomusicologist and a composer, collecting folk songs and infusing his music with them, so too did the composers of this organization and the wider community around it. They supported the collection and study of Jewish folk songs and wrote, published, and performed classical music which sought to craft a new style by using these melodies or taking inspiration from them. While many of their pieces engaged directly with melodies of Jewish folk music, others endeavored to be Jewish by telling stories taken from Jewish texts or Jewish history, and yet others celebrate more abstract and unexpected corners of the Jewish literary canon. I found this fascinating and inspiring. Here were composers grappling with questions of what it means to be a Jew and a composer, and offering a variety of deeply felt answers. This and the wider world of YIVO reminded me with a renewed intensity of the amazing diversity of what Jewishness can encompass, and inspired me to tackle the question for myself in my own music. What does being Jewish mean to me? How can I find my own place as a Jewish composer within this vast spectrum of possibilities? My new album, In All the Days Were Purple, explores the question of trying to find meaning amidst life's transience and tumult, using secular Jewish poetry as a departure point. In the opening song, the Yiddish language poem by Anna Margolin surmises that it's only in the always looming specter of death that the joy of the quotidian comes into the focus. In another Anna Margolin, set later on the album, which we're not going to hear tonight, so if you want to hear that one, this interplay between life and death is said to bring us closest to godliness. For me, these poems, and all of the songs on the album, are like secular prayers. I think framing this search for meaning within a Jewish language and with Jewish themes adds tremendous power. It grounds a modern encounter with these eternal questions within a rich lineage of struggling with God, some of which I embrace, some of which I question, but all of which I'm proud to be connected to. So you're going to hear a bit of my album later on the program, and I hope that you'll pick up a copy afterwards. For now, though, I want to tell you a bit more about those composers that I mentioned associated with the Society for Jewish Folk Music. So these aren't exactly a direct influence on the album, but as I said, they were grappling with questions that I found myself grappling with, and it was just an utter delight to be acquainted with their music and with this whole world of what's available at YIVO, so I thought it would be interesting and fun to share some of this repertoire with you all tonight, to give you a window into this treasure trove that is YIVO. So I made arrangements of 5 Yiddish and Hebrew art songs for the ensemble of my album for the exact same forces. And so we're gonna hear those 5 songs, and I'm gonna kind of walk you through each song by song, and then they're gonna play a bit of the album. So I'm gonna invite up to the stage the musicians, and I'm gonna grab them. There's been a request that phones should be turned off. So the composer of the first song tonight is Joel Engel. In many ways, Joel Engel was the spiritual father of the Society for Jewish Folk Music. He was born in Berdyansk, Ukraine in 1868, and after attending law school in Kharkov and then Kiev, Engel began studying music and moved to Moscow to study at the Imperial Conservatory in 1893. After his studies, Engel became a music critic for the Russian language newspaper, the Russian Gazette, and through the encouragement of Vladimir Statsov, became interested in Jewish folk music. Engel began studying the topic, returning to his hometown in 1900 to transcribe Jewish folk melodies, and in 1912 famously joined Shin Ansky's expedition into the Pale of the Settlement, recording melodies using the recently invented Edison wax cylinder. Shin Ansky, for those that don't know, is a really famous Yiddish folklorist and writer and playwright who wrote the Dybbuk, among other things. And so in addition to gathering and studying Jewish folk melodies, Engel arranged them into compositions. He presented them on concerts, lectured on Jewish folk music, and he encouraged other Jewish composers to create a national Jewish style of classical music with him. After a brief time in Berlin organizing concerts and music publishing to promote the Society for Jewish Folk Music's work, in 1922 to 1924, Engel moved to Palestine in 1924. In Palestine, Engel devoted his time to teaching and writing a new repertoire of children's music and folk music. He died in Tel Aviv just 3 years later at the age of 58 in 1927. Most of the work that Engel left behind was songs, piano music, chamber music. The most notable exception was the music that he wrote to accompany Shin Ansky's The Dybbuk, which he arranged into a suite for clarinet and string orchestra. The first song that we're going to hear is called Omrim Yeshna Eretz, They Say There Is a Land, and it's a setting of a poem by Hebrew poet Shaul Chernichovsky, a poem of the same name from 1923. Like Engel, Chernichovsky was born in Imperial Russia and died in British Mandate Palestine. The poem reflects on an ideal of Jewish renewal that values the Hebrew language, ancient Jewish texts, and the land of Israel. Note, however, when you're reading this text, that when the word Eretz is used, Eretz means land in Hebrew, Chernichovsky is referring to what we'd now call Israel. But when he uses the word, or presumably, when he uses the word Israel, though, he's referring to the Jewish people, in using the kind of language that you'd find in the Hebrew Bible. I should remind you that this song was written long before the state of Israel existed, long before it was called Israel. So the song then, it's pondering finding redemption in the land of Israel from Talmudic sage Rabbi Akiva, but it concludes with the Jewish paean of a more universal nature, assuring the beaten down and persecuted Jewish masses that Kol Yisrael Kadoshim, Atah HaMaccabee, all of Israel is holy, you are the Maccabee. The Maccabee referring to the ancient Israelite warriors of the Hanukkah story, famous for proudly defending and uplifting Jewishness, which was threatened by the Greek Empire during that time. So here's that song. The composer of the next song, Lazar Saminsky, was one of the founding members of the Society for Jewish Folk Music in St. Petersburg. He was born in Vale Gotslovo, Ukraine in 1882, studied with Rimsky-Korsakov and Liadov in the St. Petersburg Conservatory. Fascinated with Jewish culture, Saminsky went on trips to southern Russia and Georgia to gather Jewish folk music and ancient religious chants. Saminsky's travels brought him also to Turkey, Syria, Palestine, Paris, and England. In 1920, Saminsky immigrated to the United States, where he became an American citizen, and he co-founded the League of Composers in 1923. And he was the music director of Temple Emmanuel from 1924 to 1958. He died in 1959 in Port Chester, New York. Saminsky was also a champion of Jewish music in the US, helping to found two Jewish music organizations in America, Mailam and the Jewish Music Forum. He founded the Three Choirs Festival at Temple Emmanuel in 1936, and he championed the work of many of his Old World colleagues here in the US. Saminsky's compositional oeuvre represents a broad cross-section of Jewish music ranging from sacred to secular. His songs set texts in Hebrew, Yiddish, Ladino, and more, and his music takes inspiration from all around the Jewish world, as well as from literary and non-Jewish sources. Some highlights of Saminsky's religious work include a Sabbath service and holiday services, and Saminsky's secular output includes a variety of chamber music, including song cycles, 5 symphonies, a collection of ballets and operas, including The Vision of Ariel, The Daughter of Jephthah, and The Lament of Rachel. We have his collection here at YIVO was his passport. Saminsky's Untersorles Vigela, the song we're about to hear, is a simple arrangement of a Yiddish folk song. It's a lullaby which touches on common Yiddish tropes, folk tropes, describing a goat selling raisins and almonds. And then, in the kind of near non sequitur that only a nursery rhyme can get away with, it plugs the value of studying Torah. The folk song shows up in the Society for Jewish Folk Music's publication. They did a songbook collection for the Jewish family and school, which is an amazing archival document, which of course we have here. And in addition to showing up there, this song, just to give you a sense of how famous it was in the Ginsberg and Marek book from 1901, the Beregovsky book, it's in Yehuda Leib Kahan's book, it's in Ruth Rubin. If you're a Yiddish folklorist, perhaps that means something to you. Otherwise, it's a popular song. And it also actually was the inspiration for another song by another composer in the Society for Jewish Folk Music. And the text was the inspiration, in part, for perhaps the most famous Yiddish theater song ever, Rozinkas mit Mandlin, Raisins and Almond by Avram Goldfaden, from his operetta Shulamis. And I'm just going to give a really quick plug. Elisa Quint, who's a scholar here and is also in the audience, is working on an amazing book about Shulamis. And Ron Raboy wrote an amazing essay about the music, and he talked to me about it. They're amazing. Anyway, here's Saminsky's take on this song, which you can see right here. The composer of the next song, Alexander Veprik, was from a younger second wave of composers in this new Jewish school. Veprik was from Balta, Ukraine, but he studied at the Leipzig Conservatory as a child. He then studied the St. Petersburg Conservatory and the Moscow Conservatory, where he became involved in the world of Jewish music. At a time when many of the prominent Jewish composers of the society were leaving the Soviet Union, Veprik was thought to be a great hope for Jewish music. Sadly, the support and openness for Jewish culture in general fell precipitously in the Soviet Union. In 1950, Veprik was in fact arrested for being, quote, a Jewish nationalist and deported to the Gulag. After Stalin's death, his case was reviewed and he was allowed to go back to Moscow, but he died just a few years later. So the next song is an arrangement. Oh, sorry, I skipped. I'm talking about the wrong one.
Well, let's just do this one.
Okay, so we'll do them out of order. Sorry. That's Alexander Veprik. Okay, so the next song is an arrangement of a Yiddish folk song that those familiar with Prokofiev's overture on Hebrew themes might actually recognize as the second melody in that piece. And this is a bit of an aside, but for Prokofiev fans, it's interesting. Prokofiev got the melody for that piece from members of the Zimro ensemble who he had met when they played a show at Carnegie Hall on November 1st, 1919. And that concert featured music of composers of the Society for Jewish Folk Music, who we're hearing right now. Different composers, actually, but colleagues and very much friends doing similar things. People including Alexander Krein, Solomon Rozovsky, Leo Zeitlin, and others. So in the Saminsky arrangement that we just heard, Saminsky harmonized the tune he picked elegantly, and he gently ironed it out into a kind of little art song by fixing its rhythm and giving it an introduction and an interlude. By contrast, Veprik sets the folk song with a really imaginative chromatic harmony. And rather than create a setting that props up and showcases the tune, Veprik weaves the tune into the fabric of this short but really stunning very little piece. The song text features a narrator wishing their parents farewell as they got married, using metaphors that compare married life to a distant journey to a strange and unfamiliar place. And I think you'll hear Veprik really digs into this uncanny element. And again, this is in a lot of different folk collections and variants here at YIVO, which is kind of a cool thing. So here's that song. I really love that song. Okay. Rewinding to the one that I skipped. Okay, here is Moses Milner. So while Joel Engel moved to Palestine and Lazar Saminsky moved to New York, Moses Milner and also Alexander Veprik, who we just heard, stayed in Russia, which became the Soviet Union, of course. Moses Milner was also one of the key and early members of the Society for Jewish Folk Music, but not much is known about Milner. Story has it that he was orphaned at age 8 and became a boy alto in a cantor's traveling choir. Eventually, Milner found his way to studying at the conservatory in Kiev and at the St. Petersburg Conservatory. He's most famous for a song called In Cheder, which depicts a traditional Jewish classroom with a teacher teaching a student the Aleph Beis, which is the Jewish alphabet. But Milner's output also includes many Jewish art songs in Hebrew and Yiddish, 2 Yiddish language operas, incidental music for plays, symphonies, concertos, and even virtuoso piano music. So this next song, it's also a lullaby like the Saminsky that we'd heard earlier, but unlike the Saminsky that we heard, it's not based on a folk song, and unlike the Veprik as well. Here, Milner is taking children's poetry by Yidlamet Peretz, who is one of the fathers of modern Yiddish literature, and he adapts it and he sets it to music. So while the poetry very much intimates a bucolic scene of a kind of could-be folk song, the music is actually proceeds with a quiet sophistication and an elegant chromaticism. The song is from a set of 10 which adapt Peretz's poetry, which scholar Neil Levin compares to Robert Schumann's Kinderszenen, explaining they're simple but hardly simplistic, childlike rather than childish. So here's one of those songs. Okay, so the next song is the last one on this set of music from YIVO's archives. It's another song by Lazar Saminsky, the second composer we heard from tonight. I've gotten to know Lazar Saminsky's work particularly well because Professor Neil Levin, as I alluded to earlier, donated Lazar Saminsky's archive to YIVO a few years ago. And I went through the archive to curate a concert of Saminsky's music, which we did at Temple Emmanuel, where Saminsky was the music director for many years, in June 2017. This last song is a beautiful setting of the opening text of the biblical Song of Songs, or Shir HaShirim as it's known in Hebrew. The Song of Songs is one of the few texts of the Hebrew Bible that does not discuss God at all. It's actually a collection of erotic poetry. In traditional Jewish thought, it's considered to be an allegory for love between God and the Jewish people. But because the text itself doesn't mention God, many people have read this text in a variety of ways throughout history. And it's a text that a lot of secular Jews in particular turned to in the early 20th century and beyond when looking for a text with a decidedly Jewish grounding that can be adapted to a variety of different contexts. We actually did a whole concert about pieces influenced by the Song of Songs here, which was really fun, and if you're curious, check it out online, it's on YouTube. So here, Saminsky sets the words of the opening of the Song of Songs using a melody which he says he collected in Georgia on his travels. It was originally a part of a song cycle inspired by that ethnomusicological work called 6 Songs from the Russian Orient, and Saminsky also created instrumental versions of this tune as well, which leads me to think maybe it was a little bit of a hit, and I think if you hear it, you'll know why. It's really beautiful. So. So I hope you enjoyed this little glimpse into some of the musical treasures that YIVO has in its archives upstairs. It's now my pleasure to bring up to the stage Michael Gordon, who's going to say a few words before we hear the first 5 tracks of the album. Michael.
Hi everyone. I am so delighted to be here, and it was so delightful to hear the first half of this concert with these great musicians and the fabulous Eliza Bagg, who is just my favorite singer. I think the real treat, though, is coming up because we're going to be hearing the first part of Alex's new album, and it's, you know, as you, having a part in the label Cantaloupe Music that's putting this album out. Tonight it's new, but it's years of work writing this piece, recording it, designing it, and coming to this night. So it's a very special event. Alex, you wrote a beautiful piece of music that's deep and direct and moving. So I can't wait to hear the second part of this concert. I just very briefly want to say one thing. I grew up in a Yiddish-speaking family. My parents would speak, and I would ask them, what does that mean? And they would look at each other and start debating, this, that, and this happened over and over again. Finally, my mother would turn to me and she said, "There's no way to translate that." And that's what Yiddish is. So it's so great to have new work in this language, new Yiddish art, and I'm delighted to be here. Congratulations to Alex, and let's hear the second half of the concert.
So if you like that bit of the album, get the rest of it. That's only about 1/3 of it. So fittingly, that last song there was about a twinkle violette floim, dark violet plum. So among the treats for us outside, in addition to the album which you can purchase, we've got plum tarts and a lot of other purple food. So I hope you'll join us in the lobby. Thank you so much.